Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Asia Society Policy Institute's event, Retooling the Belt and Road Initiative, Digital Guidance for Better Outcomes. I'm Rorry Daniels. I'm the Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I'm filling in today as moderator for Mary Kay Magison, who unfortunately could not join us. But I'm so excited to be here and to help introduce this wonderful project we have tonight. I think the importance of this project for me is really twofold. One, it's about the Belt and Road Initiative, which of course is China's flagship global infrastructure development program, a multi-trillion-dollar investment in developing countries to which over 140 countries in the world have signed on in some way. So although the Belt and Road has its critics and detractors, it is undeniably affecting the development of the world. And we're here today to talk a little bit about some of that criticism. China's Belt and Road Initiative has been criticized because more is not always necessarily better. It's been criticized for not paying enough attention to the needs of the communities it serves. Here at the Asia Society Policy Institute, we have a solutions-oriented mandate to not only give policymakers recommendations for how things could be done better, but also to go a step further and take that knowledge and package it so that it can make a difference in wider civil society and communities. This is one of those projects. Our digital toolkit has been designed to help empower local stakeholders to deal with the challenges of the Belt and Road Initiative. And with me tonight to introduce the project and to give a quick demonstration of this digital toolkit, we have Asia Society Policy Institute's Danny Russel, who is the Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy, and Blake Berger, our Associate Director. Danny has a long, illustrious career in government. He most recently served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. And Blake has been working with us at the Asia Society Policy Institute for a number of years, particularly on issues related to Southeast Asia. In a little while, we'll open up this conversation a little wider so we can discuss the implications of the digital toolkit for the communities affected by the Belt and Road Initiative with some experts on global development, particularly China's engagement in global development, Shawn, Shea, and Jessica DiCarlo. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Danny to give us a broad introduction of this project. Danny, over to you.
Thanks so much, Rory. First of all, I want to acknowledge and thank our funder and strong supporter, the Ford Foundation. The Ford team has been absolutely wonderful as partners in this process. So the genesis of this project came from a report that we issued back in 2019 called Navigating the Belt and Road, Navigating the BRI, where we identified some of the chronic problems that we found in our research in BRI projects. And we offered some very specific recommendations aimed at preventing those kind of problems, aimed at helping the projects to yield better outcomes. And the problems that we saw that just kept cropping up in one project, one country after another were largely issues that affected local communities and affected individual stakeholders in the developing countries. Things like land rights, labor standards, health, safety, those sorts of things. And two of the main reasons, I think, for those chronic problems seem to be one that Chinese developers often skip the upfront kind of pre-project due diligence, the steps that you need to take before a project is finalized, let alone started, so that you can anticipate some of the potential problems and risks. There's a name for that study. It's called Environmental and Social Impact Assessments, ESIAs. That's your first of many acronyms. The second thing, though, that we found is one of the drivers of these chronic problems was that in project after project, there was little, or in many cases, no real communication between the Chinese project managers or construction companies and the affected local communities. Some of it was language issues, but some of it was that most developers thought that as long as they got the green light from the power holder in the capital, they had the authorization, and sort of that's it. So the issue of what the local people want, don't want, are concerned about, their interests, at best that seemed to be an afterthought. And the result of these things was that often there were problems that led to local backlash. And as we saw in several cases, that actually led to either significant and expensive delays in the project or actual project failure. So we recommended that BRI project planners ought to conduct a very thorough ESIA to scope and to de-risk the project, and do that in the design phase, not scramble once the problems start. And second, that we urged the developers and the construction companies to be sure to consult local community members and try to keep them informed throughout the project life cycle, since, among other things, talking to the local community serves as an early warning system for things that may be going wrong in the project. And the managers in the company and the project managers really need to know that earlier the better. But we made these recommendations. I, however, having had a career in government as a policymaker, serving in Washington, but serving mostly in the field, and also working for ASPE, a think and do tank, as you explained, Rory, I understood that identifying a problem and making a recommendation is at best only half the battle, right? It's a good start, but it doesn't get you where you want to go, because it's one thing to tell people what they ought to do, right? And why they ought to do it. It's a very different thing to show them how they can do it. So what you're about to see this is not your grandmother's think tank report, right? It's not going to sit on the shelf. We designed a kind of user's manual built around these two basic recommendations, something that would give both groups, the Chinese side and the local side, practical tools that they could use to prevent problems and to safeguard their own interests, frankly. So we created what we're calling a digital toolkit, and that really is a microsite that provides practical how-to information. Everything you wanted to ask about a Belt and Road project, but were afraid to ask. So it's designed, first of all, to be used by people in local communities, by different stakeholders in a developing country where there is a project that are affected by it, right? And people can be affected in a lot of different ways. But what this toolkit will do is, at a minimum, to help them to understand how the Chinese developers and financiers operate. And it offers them things like checklists and resources that they can use to protect their own interests. And Blake and Jacinta will walk you through those. The toolkit outlines, very actionable steps, practical steps that local groups can take to do things like ask questions, share their ideas, engage in public advocacy, things they can do if they have a complaint or a grievance, and other things that they can do to safeguard the overall community. And as I said, these are all things that can prevent problems, that can reduce friction, and that can lead to better outcomes. So there's something in it for both sides. But specifically for the Chinese users, whether they are financing a project or designing it or managing it or working on building it, and a lot of these people are going to be engineers and construction experts who, frankly, may not know very much about the country or the society that they happen to be working in. For them, we explain, first of all, the rationale for conducting an environmental and a social impact assessment, the rationale for stakeholder engagement, but more importantly, we describe what does this really look like in practical terms? How do you go about it? What do you need to do? And we've translated the toolkit into Mandarin, into Chinese, and we are going to add that to the site soon to make it that much easier for these Chinese engineers or developers to actually use it. As Blake and Jacinta will explain, we deliberately designed the toolkit so that it will work well on smartphones, which is how most people in the developing world access the internet. And so even that it will work well in low bandwidth areas in the developing world. Now, the developing world is a big place. We did most of our research in Southeast Asia, so we're beginning next with translation into 3 additional languages of countries where there are a large number of Chinese projects. So Cambodia, that's Khmer, Laos, the Lao PDR, Lao, and Indonesia, Bahasa. And those versions will go up on the website in the period ahead. And fingers crossed, we'd love to be able to add more languages as we go on in the future. But in the meantime, the English language version of the toolkit can be super useful to people in communities and in many other parts of the world who potentially are affected by Belt and Road or other Chinese projects. So enough from me. With that, let me turn to Blake and Jacinta and ask them to explain a bit about our research process, sort of what we did, and most importantly, to give everybody a guided tour of the digital toolkits. So thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Unfortunately, because of COVID, instead of actually being able to travel ourselves to Southeast Asia and to China to meet with government officials, community members, local, and a variety of different stakeholders, we had to pivot and reached out to a wonderful network of NGO partners who are on the ground in Indonesia, in Laos, and in Cambodia to assist us in conducting outreach to local communities and stakeholders, and also in pulling together research on the impacts of these projects on local society and the environment. So in order to ensure that our recommendations were really truly meeting the needs of the affected populations and people throughout the project, we held virtual roundtable discussions with local communities and had the opportunity to speak with and directly hear from them.
We heard some concerning and devastating stories. One community member dialed into the meeting while he was on the run from local authorities after he protested against the demolition of his home by bulldozers. This was seen across several Chinese investments, including railways, airports, highways, and energy infrastructure. Many people had their farmland expropriated, but were either not compensated or received compensation well below the market rate. We heard from families whose livelihoods and health were essentially destroyed. Women were worried as their children were developing rashes all over their bodies. And due to the construction of a power plant, they no longer had access to fresh and clean water. Additionally, one community relayed stories about how explosions resulting from tunneling for a railway caused significant damage to community property. They began to see cracks form in their homes and also lost access to running water. This community was never consulted during the ESIA process, and they were left completely unaware of project developments.
Throughout the project, we worked with a spectacular group of advisory members who were comprised of esteemed experts from around the world on actually identifying the specific issues and on developing recommendations that incorporated the views of the impacted populations. With that, Jacinta and I will provide you with a guided tour of the digital toolkit. So each user will begin on this landing page with a navigational menu on the side. The navigational menu contains access to the visual step-by-step timeline, checklists which organizes recommended actions that people can take and resources that they can use, a mapping of stakeholders, essentially the who's who, what they do, and how to contact them, relevant laws, policies, and guidelines for China and internationally, supplementary resources that people can access for more information and help, and an expansive glossary of the meaning of terms and acronyms that are potentially new to them. So those are the overarching main categories of the site. The landing page will also briefly introduce users to the focus of this toolkit, and the users will have the option to tap Learn More for further insight into our story and how the toolkits were developed. After the introduction, our first-time users will be able to scroll down to the How To Use section to learn more about the flow of information on the site. Throughout the toolkits, we have used icons as visual clues to make sure that it is more intuitive for the users to be able to navigate the website. Examples include the blue handshake for stakeholder engagement and the green magnifying glass for environmental and social impact assessments. So once users are done with reading through the How-To section, they can click Get Started. Once clicking Get Started, they will arrive at the step-by-step timeline, which illustrates the separate processes for both stakeholder engagement in blue and also for environmental and social impact assessments in green. The life cycle of any infrastructure project can be broken down into really three distinct phases: pre-project planning, project implementation, and project operations. So that's how this timeline here is divided into. Users can see both ESIA and stakeholder engagement together, or use the toggle to just see the one that they're specifically interested in. Clicking on each line in the desktop version will allow users to see what each step is called. So let's turn off stakeholder engagement and focus solely on environmental and social impact assessments. We can click through to see what all the different steps in the ESIA process are. For example, here is project categorization and screening, followed by project scoping, and preparation and implementation of an ESIA. And once you click on a step, you can actually click View More to access the specific checklist. But prior to looking at one of the checklists, we're going to show you the complete steps for both stakeholder engagement and for ESIAs. This page allows the user to see all 6 steps in stakeholder engagement and all 8 steps in the ESIA at the same time. But let's just say you're a user from Southeast Asia seeking to better understand how Chinese developers or contractors are actually supposed to engage with the affected people and other local stakeholders. They can click on Inclusive Stakeholder Participation and Consultation. This brings them to the checklist page that describes exactly what that process entails. So they can scroll down for more information, as this page provides how it should work according to Chinese and international rules and best practices. What are the recommended actions for affected communities, CSOs and NGOs and other host country stakeholders to take? And it gives the rationale for why stakeholders should be included and consulted properly throughout the life cycle of the project. We also help Chinese actors understand how this process should work according to both Chinese domestic and overseas practices and international best practices. The checklist page also provides links to helpful sample documents, handbooks, and other websites. Users can also reach this checklist page directly from the step-by-step timeline. While the checklist references the role of various stakeholders and users that could be involved in a Belt and Road project, the stakeholder page is really meant to help 4 distinct groups. First, help communities that could truly benefit from various stakeholder support. Second, help CSOs and NGOs in the region and internationally build a network and find other groups that are working on these issues pertaining to inclusive and sustainable infrastructure development. Third, provide host country governments, particularly local officials, with more information about who to engage in the process and how. And fourth, help Chinese stakeholders understand who beyond government officials should be informed and consulted on BRI projects and why that's in their interests. So let's just say a user is interested in learning more about CSOs and NGOs and that they want to reach groups that can assist them in facilitating dialogue with Chinese contractors, developers, or financiers. They could click onto that specific category. Users can then learn about the roles and responsibilities of each type of stakeholder. And here they can learn about Chinese organizations, international organizations, organizations in their own country, or organizations in other BRI host countries. For example, let's click on international. This brings users to a page with dozens and dozens of international organizations that could, or actually potentially already do, provide support to local people affected by Belt and Road projects. Let's click on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Here, they can get a description and the addresses, email address, websites and phone numbers, fax numbers, and the social media accounts. But let's just say users would also like to learn more about specific Chinese or international laws or policies or guidelines. They'd be able to click onto this next section of the toolkit. Chinese contractors actually may be particularly interested in accessing the relevant Chinese laws, policies, and guidelines all in one place. Or community members or local CSOs or NGOs can check the relevant Chinese laws or policies, as well as what international best practices are, so they know what they can ask for and know how to make their case. So for example, let's click on Chinese. And let's look at the Belt and Road Ecological Environmental Cooperation Plan. Here, they'll be able to see who the issuer is, key points on both stakeholder engagement and ESIAs, as well as links to the full version and other related documents, such as the guidance on promoting a green Belt and Road. Additionally, we've also collated relevant resources for each step, each checklist step, and for additional areas of potential interest. So for example, let's click on ESIA. And then let's click on preparation and implementation of an ESIA. Here, users can access a range of information, sample documents, and templates that they can find helpful. And last but not least, we have developed a glossary of all terminology that will help establish a foundation for communication between Chinese actors, host country government officials, and local communities and stakeholders. There are lots of terms and concepts that may come up in discussions about a project that people, or for that matter, Chinese construction managers, may not be familiar with. So we categorize this glossary so users can, for example, scroll down to corporate social responsibility and get a definition, as well as where we got the sources from. Our glossary is drawn from a combination of Chinese sources, for example, like the China International Contractors Association, and international sources like the UN Industrial Development Organization. So all parties can have a common understanding of the key terms and acronyms and be able to engage in constructive dialogue to improve Belt and Road projects. With that, thank you so much, and we can end the screen share now. Back over to you, Rory.
Well, thank you, Blake and Jacinta, who is a program assistant here with us at ASPE. I think that, and Danny as well, you guys have given an excellent overview of what looks like a treasure trove of information for people who want to get a sense of how BRI could be improved and to deal with the problems in their local communities. I'd like to take the opportunity now to welcome two additional outside experts, Shawn Shea and Jessica DiCarlo, into the conversation. Shawn is the founder and director of Social Innovations Advisory Limited and has worked on improving resilient civil societies in China and the Global South for many years. He has a number of affiliations and has written extensively and published extensively on China's political economy, corruption, civil society. He also maintains a blog on NGOs in China if you're interested in learning more. We also have with us Jessica DiCarlo. Jessica is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of British Columbia. Her doctoral dissertation was on ethnographic fieldwork in Laos and China, where she examined construction and planning of the Laos-China Railway. She's also worked and lived in Asia in a number of capacities since 2008, including in China, Nepal, Tibet, India, and Laos. Shawn and Jessica, thank you guys so much for joining us. I want to talk a little bit more broadly about some of the issues that this toolkit could address. So Shawn, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you. I think that Danny very adeptly described or linked the lack of due diligence by development firms, particularly by Chinese development firms in the BRI, to the success or failure of their project to thrive in a local community. But I think for many of our guests and listeners tonight, this idea of an environmental social impact assessment is something new and a little bit technical. So could you walk us through the background on an ESIA? What are the steps that would be important to take, and why are they important to the local communities?
Thank you, Rory. Yeah, so first of all, I just want to congratulate Asian Society Policy Institute on developing these toolkits. I think, you know, there's been a lot of research on the BRI, but not many organizations have taken the next step to really develop tools and methods to help communities and civil societies in developing countries. You know, this is a great set of toolkits, and I think will serve as a really good model for other communities and civil society organizations that I think want to engage Chinese stakeholders on the Belt and Road. Yeah, on the toolkit specifically, I think that you know, these are really critical toolkits. I mean, and for example, the ESIA process. I mean, I think Danny already alluded to a number of, and I think Jacinta, to a number of cases where ESIA, the environmental and social impact assessment, wasn't really carried out very thoroughly. And this is a critical step, you know, before the project is actually implemented, to really understand what the environmental and social impact is on communities. I mean, it really varies across countries. Every country has their own sort of ESIA laws and regulations, but you know, typically it involves meetings with communities to try to understand the environmental and social impact assessments. Typically, the ESIAs are carried out by consulting companies, so an ESIA is always also only as good as the company that actually carries it out. And I think, you know, Chinese companies have been very good about finding consulting companies that will carry it out in a way that will just be you know, expedient. So I think, you know, that's something that really needs to be improved on, that communities are really not properly consulted in these processes. Meetings are called sort of at the last minute. People don't understand why the meetings are called, what's the reason. They're often not given any warning about the project coming to their communities. And of course, you know, the consultants will present the project in the best possible light. So I think, you know, there's a lot of issues involved regarding the ESIA process. And there's a number of other areas, I think, you know, that these toolkits address. I mean, again, the need for better sort of communication channels between the communities and the companies themselves. I mean, setting up sort of community teams, or, you know, community committees that can communicate with somebody to engage the companies, as well as, you know, grievance mechanisms, I think, are another important one. You know, having some kind of channel for feedback from the communities as well. So, you know, I think all these areas are things that there's a lot of work to be, a lot of improvement that is needed.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to get into the issue of feedback from the local communities momentarily, but it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, there's actually a value for the developers as well in doing these environmental social impact assessments, that it's really not just the local communities that benefit, but the surfaces problems that would be, you know, easier and maybe more efficient to address ahead of the project moving forward rather than after the fact. And, you know, given the very disturbing stories that have surfaced during the course of your research, certainly I think things that everyone in the process would like to avoid. Jessica, I'd like to turn to you. How are local communities seeing Chinese developers in BRI projects now? Has this, you know, the barriers to communication that have been described, and the feeling that these Chinese developers are very removed from the process, that they're working through consultants, how has that affected local communities' perceptions of Belt and Road Initiative projects?
Thanks for that question. And I'll also second Shawn's sentiments that this toolkit is really going to offer a comprehensive and important resource to a huge range of stakeholders. I think when we talk about local communities, that's one of many. So really great work to the team over there. And thanks so much, Danny, Blake, and Jacinta for involving me in this project. It is so important, I believe, to translate academic research into policy and practice. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. Gosh, where to begin with local perspectives? They're entirely varied, of course. I can speak to things, and I will speak to things today from perspectives that I gathered in Laos. So I guess I want to just kind of at first start with some of the issues that came up across our research in villages and with certain stakeholders, and what's happening, and then those in turn shape perspectives of projects. But in some places there has been more job opportunities for wage labor. There has been technology transfer to communities, various knockoff effects of these investments. So I have seen those effects from people, and I'll talk about them more. And then a lot of what we've talked about, kind of the local environmental degradation, pollution to rivers. There are often transboundary environmental effects depending on the projects. In my own work, I've focused a lot on land. So land acquisition or appropriation, compensation, and in turn, kind of the local livelihood impacts of increased food insecurity. And that could be from the environmental degradation or loss of land or access to land that people were once farming. Also, sometimes poor labor standards, health impacts. So a lot of the things that you've talked about. Around some of my land work, one of the things that I found often overlooked, we tend to talk about displacement, dispossession of people from their land and resources, but I found that around a lot of these large projects, it was really the suspension of livelihoods and the waiting that people were held in that was most disruptive. They were told when the project's done, you'll be able to get your land back or resume life as usual, but there's kind of this precarity around waiting. So I found that to be one way. If people were directly affected by a project, that kind of waiting and suspension really shaped their views. So I guess to answer your question on views, one way I've been thinking about this in Laos and the railroad is kind of a corridor perspective to parse apart the different local perspectives. So I found in closer to border areas with China, local Lao people, a number of them said, this is China and Laos as usual. Chinese people come over the border, we speak Chinese, there's Chinese radio. So kind of a business as usual sense for folks that maybe weren't directly affected by projects. Other people, I remember talking to friends, younger nieces and nephews who were very excited about employment opportunities that the railroad would bring. So there's kind of this hype around it. And then it was really communities that were close to construction and what we're talking about now with impact assessments who were disrupted. So local views of projects tended to be less about a BRI frame and more about a disruptive infrastructure. And there was partial talk of it being a Chinese project. And also a really important point people made was that local governments were often involved in these impact assessments or various monitoring evaluation tools. So I think what was really interesting about it was that it was simultaneously a BRI issue and also pointed to some of the bigger structural issues in Laos. And I'm happy to go into more as we keep talking.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this idea that the BRI is not just, China going into an external country and doing whatever it wants, but it's often helped along the way, not only by, local governments that are seeking development for legitimate reasons, but also by people themselves who are making their own cost-benefit analysis based on how close they sit to the project, on how the project is affecting them. Danny, you spent a lot of time talking to people about exactly this topic. What are the incentives for the project and how is the project affecting them? Could you walk us through some of the reactions that you saw in the local communities to these BRI projects?
Yeah, thank you, Rory. Look, I guess I'd answer this in two different ways. In terms of actual reactions, as you alluded to, you get different responses from people in different parts of the food chain, so to speak, in different parts of the process. Local businessmen that we spoke to would complain that the Chinese weren't using local products. I'll never forget speaking to one businessman who was explaining his frustration and who finally threw up his hands and said, the Chinese even brought their own nails. So the one issue, of course, is procurement. There was the issue we heard about from both community leaders and local officials that there weren't enough training programs to upskill locals so that they could take over the operation of a project that was designed to be transferred to local actors and local businesses once it had been built and started to operate. And that sort of takes me back to your earlier question about the value of a social impact assessment. So if you haven't really carefully done the forward thinking about the project, but instead just sort of raced to get all the approvals and get the paperwork done, then you may not have thought ahead about, okay, it may take 1 year or 2 years to train the locals that we're going to need to run and operate this project because you didn't really know what the level of technical skills in this part of the country was. You didn't find out until too late. We saw projects where the Chinese had overpromised what it would mean in terms of local employment, but that in reality, there weren't many jobs that went to the community. And the jobs that were assigned to host country nationals all too often were jobs like driver, security guard, cook, maid, gardener, those very menial jobs. And that was a source of frustration. Jessica alluded to land problems, and there were land problems galore. Residents, farmers, landowners who lost land, lost time, lost value. And then more broadly, even among local officials who saw the benefits and maybe had very high expectations about what a project would deliver, there are cases where there's a bit of a hangover when the project is done, that the road, the railroad, the port, the plant was proving not to actually be commercially viable and was not bringing the kind of prosperity to the region that folks had expected.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the answers that I'm hearing tonight and the content of this conversation has to do about hype, right? And about expectations not being met. I wonder, Shawn, if you could talk a little bit about what Chinese stakeholders are doing to address this, because of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, a packaged initiative under the leadership of Xi Jinping, has put together all of these projects of various types and quality. But in the end, the reputation of China is in how they are delivered and perceived in the local communities. So could you tell us a little bit about what Chinese actors and stakeholders are doing to, as Xi Jinping has directed, improve the quality of these projects?
Yeah, thank you. As you mentioned, I mean, the Belt and Road is a flagship program for China. It's an important source of China's sort of image around the world, its soft power. So it does pay a lot of attention to that, and increasingly so as you've gotten more pushback from host country governments, from communities, from civil society. Rightly so. I mean, I think the stories that Danny just told are very familiar to me also in my field work that I've done on these BRI projects. So Chinese stakeholders are doing something. I mean, they are responding to this kind of this kind of pushback. I think, for a long time, Chinese stakeholders were relying on their good relations with host country governments, with local authorities, to get the project through, implemented smoothly, to deal with any kind of pushback from local communities or civil society. And I think they found that that approach doesn't really work because, for one, they're not really communicating with the communities themselves. Secondly, the perception that they're working only with the host country government or with local authorities, I think, reinforces this perception. It's very common among locals that there's a lot of corruption going on. And this is a big source of resentment as well, not just the impact on the communities, but the kind of corruption that all this investment is feeding. So in response, I think Chinese stakeholders are beginning to take steps, even at the very highest level. I mean, Xi Jinping came out a couple of years ago and talked about the need to promote more high-quality infrastructure, more green infrastructure, more open, more transparent, more sustainable infrastructure. So, this is a very high-level call to Chinese stakeholders to pay more attention to abiding by host country laws, because they realize that these host countries are not like Hong Kong, where they can just control things in Hong Kong using a national security law. They actually have to work and negotiate with the host country and abide by their laws. So, to do that, to respect local cultures, and to do a better job of communicating with local communities. So, there's been more efforts by some Chinese stakeholders to develop toolkits, sort of similar to what you see that has been developed by the Asia Society Policy Institute. So one that comes to mind that I was involved in is this it's a handbook for how to engage with communities in developing countries. And this is a handbook that was developed by a Chinese consulting company that was in collaboration with a large industry association whose members were state-owned companies, and then they used this handbook to do trainings for a number of state-owned companies in China. And they found that there was a real need and a real kind of demand for this kind of training, because a lot of these companies were coming across community pushback and they didn't know how to deal with it. And so I think they really welcomed these kinds of workshops. So that's just one example. But I think there's other examples as well. There's now a push to set up grievance mechanisms within, I think it's within the Chinese, banking regulatory system, that they're trying to require Chinese banks to set up regular grievance mechanisms that in projects that they finance. So you are beginning to see this kind of response from Chinese stakeholders. I would say that response is slow and incremental and slow to come by, and certainly from the point of view of communities, not enough and not fast enough. But it is there.
Rory, could I jump in on that real quick? I think Shawn makes a super important point. What we found was that the developers themselves come into projects believing that they are not responsible for things that the host government is supposed to be doing, for implementing local laws, et cetera. But what they find over time, and certainly what we saw, is that they may not legally or literally be responsible, but they are held responsible by the local community because, hey, it's a Chinese project. So number one, you have reputational damage to China, and that's something that has caught the attention of decision makers in Beijing. And second, you have financial damage because if a project is stalled, if disaffected villagers vandalize equipment or block the road, that translates into expenses and project cost overruns and so on. And frankly, the Chinese treasury in this global environment, the economic environment, is not really in a position to just keep subsidizing endlessly projects that are going nowhere. So I think these two things have contributed to creating a demand signal for the kind of tools and the handbook that Shawn mentioned, which, by the way, we've linked to in our resources. I'd add that domestically, the Chinese have many, many good mechanisms, like complaint hotlines and so on, but they haven't translated those to overseas projects. And so the purpose of our toolkit is to make it easier for the developers to do the things that they increasingly recognize are necessary for the success of the project.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective, which I think, again, is a little bit undervalued. And one thing that I really like about this toolkit is that it does kind of assume that all actors would like to work in good faith if the information was available to them to do so, and that having that information available can put some pressure on all of the actors to continue to work in good faith. I want to turn to Blake in a minute just to talk about how this toolkit might be used to the primary users. How could it be seen from both the developer perspective, but also from the perspective of civil society? But I'd like to just, for 1 minute, talk a little bit more about the increasing sophistication of Chinese financed infrastructure projects. So, it strikes me that a lot of the criticism of these projects, that they move too fast, that they aren't taking into account the local communities, can almost be applied in reverse to major multilateral development banks. The criticism there is that they move too slow, that they spend too much time on assessment and not enough time, too much time and resources spent prepping for a project, and things don't get done fast enough. Jessica, I wonder if you could help us kind of understand that gap a little bit. What are some of the main differences between Chinese policies and guidelines advanced by multilateral development banks? And where is there like a sweet spot between, rushing things through with a horrible impact and not being able to meet the needs of the developing world because the mechanisms move too slowly?
Yeah, thanks for that. Great question. I have so many things I want to say to that. I think you're making me think first of kind of looking how safeguards, I guess, evolved and where they started from. So, if we kind of take a step back from China, for the World Bank, that's really where safeguards were first introduced in about the 80s. And the World Bank really became the norm setter. So many other MDBs, multilateral development banks, such as the Asian Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction, the African Development Bank, really set their safeguards around what the World Bank was doing. And we saw a number of countries around the world do that too. So, you had by the 1990s, these safeguards that were standard across MDBs, the private sector, integrated into host countries. What was interesting is that it was only after longer term effects started emerging around projects did we get all these studies that said actually, World Bank safeguards and track records are maybe mixed at best, and you kind of get that same criticism that emerged. So I'm not sure, it was 2017, the World Bank ended up putting out their new environmental, social framework. And I think watching that trajectory makes me think a lot about how China is doing development overseas today. And what's really interesting here is that in relation to China, these past through decades of safeguarding and kind of the limitations and failures there came with a common view from borrowing countries that, yes, projects were slow, but that these regulations were burdensome, they were extra legal, they placed conditionalities on countries. So this Chinese approach that has become popularized is really viewed as an alternative, more straightforward path to access capital. And it doesn't have the same Western conditionalities, and there's quicker project completion. So it's known as deferential financing or recognition. So the use of host country policies instead of Chinese or international policies to really speed up projects and access capital. But just as we saw with the kind of failures of World Bank policies, we're also seeing that kind of this non-interference of from the 1950s to the 2000s from China is not working. So I guess some examples, and this builds on what Shawn was saying. In 2017, you had an MOU between China's Ministry of Finance and a number of the leading MDBs to try to establish cooperation for higher quality infrastructure investments. In 2019, you had a report between the China Development Bank, one of the main policy banks, and the United Nations Development Program on trying to have more sustainable standards and harmonize across standards. And just this year, actually in 2022, China's General Office of the Ministry of Ecology and Environment issued ecological and environmental protection guidelines for these projects. So I think we're seeing a lot of similar reactions like we did compared to World Bank projects. And I'll quickly wrap up and just say I had done an assessment in 2019 kind of comparing standards between Lao national law, multilateral development banks that work in the region, as well as Chinese policy banks. And you're absolutely correct that there's a qualitative difference in those kind of the checklists for each bank. The AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the ADB, and the World Bank share really similar lists from everything from land compensation, resettlement, environmental safeguards, grievance mechanisms, and they're very similar to the Lao laws. And it's really when you look at the China Exim Bank and CDB that you see a number of gaps there because they're deferring to Lao laws, which should actually be there because they're on the books. So I guess to just kind of wrap up this long-winded answer, I recall someone in a village was saying to me about we were talking about policy issues with the railway, and they said, well, it's not a policy issue, this is an implementation issue. And I think that's one reason these toolkits can be really useful, and that they're reaching out to different stakeholder groups that really have power to implement things. It's not just that they're on the books, but the information has to get out there. So I will stop there, but thank you for that great question.
No, thank you. It's really, to me, very fascinating to talk about all the different actors, and you can have actors that are in the same country, but really following different sets of guidelines and standards, which does bring me directly to my next question for Blake, which is, how do you envision this toolkit being used? What are kind of the use cases that people would use the toolkit for, and who are the primary users from your perspective?
Thank you, Rory. I would say really, as we've outlined throughout the event tonight, is that it's really the toolkits are catered for both, not only the local communities and local stakeholders who have been impacted, but also for the range of Chinese actors involved, the financiers, the developers, and contractors. So when thinking about, putting yourself into the shoes of a local stakeholder or a local community member, the toolkit could be a real value added in being able for them to understand where exactly they are in the Belt and Road project, what recourse they have, what should be done. Really just putting that information in kind of a one-stop shop website where they'd be able to immediately log on and see, oh, wow, this is where I could be potentially in the Belt and Road project. This is what should have been done. I should have been contacted at these different moments. And so really kind of putting the tools at their disposal. And also, as we mentioned, really to help NGOs and CSOs actually connect with one another and, actually conduct outreach to local communities and provide the support that's so desperately needed. One of the things that we found is that, better understanding by all can really actually help problems from even emerging or metastasizing. And in the long term, reduce the risks of protests or, negative outcomes. And I would also say that, for the Chinese side of the equation and the actors involved, really helping them to understand the impacts that they're having on local communities, what they should be doing in terms of conducting outreach. Here are the steps that they can take and why it's in their benefit. So really the toolkit's actually addressed and really can be used by both sides of the equation, from the local stakeholders and also the Chinese, but also, local government officials who are interested in understanding how these things actually operate and how they actually work. And so that being said, really the goal is for these measures to be put out there so that people can, Chinese companies can help de-risk these infrastructure problems, avoid the kind of problems that we're seeing, and ultimately, push and ensure that Belt and Road projects do lead to better outcomes and not only some of the negative aspects that we've seen so far.
Yeah. Blake, I'd like to just stick with you for a second, or even turn back to Danny on how specifically about this question of building networks among local civil society organizations, local community leaders. What was your sense from your research in the region of how those different civil society organizations work together now? And how do you think a common, repository of knowledge might work to strengthen those networks and those teams?
Thank you, Rory. I would say that, in our conversations with NGOs and CSOs in the region, while they may be aware of some of the groups that are actually conducting outreach or, providing support to local communities, they're not aware of the entire landscape. And that's what we've really done here with the stakeholder mapping, is really kind of provide all the different stakeholders, NGOs, CSOs, INGOs, who could really actually provide support and actually give not only the NGOs, but local communities as well, their contact information. How do you actually reach out to them? In our conversation, especially with groups that help protect indigenous communities, they weren't really sure who they could reach out to kind of discuss their issues. So if you were able, just for an example, an indigenous protection community in Cambodia, and you wanted to be able to conduct outreach to a similar group in Indonesia or in Laos or elsewhere in Southeast Asia, that's what our stakeholder mapping does. It really kind of puts that information in their hands. They can conduct that outreach, talk about similar strategies that work, things that have not worked, and ways and potentially that they can collaborate and move forward to protect the communities that they're most involved with.
So if I could build on Blake's good answer, another way of saying it is, this is a way of showing people that they are not alone, that there are people they can reach out to, there are places they can go for information, for help, for precedents, for experience. My view has been that, an educated consumer is going to be in the best position to make good choices about their interests, the future of their community, the future of their country, and so on. I will hasten to say that we're not, stimulating a color revolution. We're not using NGOs as, pawns or anything like that. We're connecting people. We're giving them some resources. So stakeholders, who do I call? Who would I contact? How would I go about reaching them? And that's not limited to civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations. It includes, how do I contact the Chinese embassy? How do I talk to a Chinese developer? Or maybe I want to reach out to the Chinese financiers as well. Moreover, the flip side of the stakeholder list is that it answers the question for the Chinese side: who should I be talking to if this is what I want to do, if that's what I want to do? And if I don't want to be limited, simply always going through the middleman of the person in the capital that I've been dealing with. The checklist as well kind of answers the practical question, okay, I understand that I ought to be doing this, that it's good for the project if I do this, but how the heck do I do it? Where do I start? What's step number one? What's step number two? Resources. There's an immense set of links to a whole host of documents and case studies and organizations and guidelines. Somebody we briefed described it as the BRI Wikipedia in a way. So a whole host of resources that spares people the agony of having to hunt and peck on the internet to find things that might be relevant. And then lastly, we've talked about ESIA, NGOs, CSOs, all kinds of jargon. Well, the glossary is like a big encyclopedia where you saw on the screen a lot of variations of color of the text. Well, whether it's in the glossary or whether it's hyperlinked, people will be able to click on a phrase or a concept that they're encountering, but they don't necessarily understand, and get a crisp definition in the languages that we've been able to translate so far. They get it in their own language. And the important thing is that it's based on research that bridges the gap between the Chinese definition of a given technical concept and another international definition.
Yes, thanks for that, Danny. I think that this idea that there is, experience sharing and best practice sharing is really consequential for getting a fuller picture of what is possible when it comes to development projects in the region. Shawn, I wanted to ask you about best case scenarios. Have there been instances that you know of where communities have worked, in tandem with Chinese developers to have their grievances addressed, or have pushed back against projects in a way that came to, benefit them in the long term?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I just want to sort of piggyback on some of the other comments that have been made. I see that, this set of toolkits, ideally could serve as like a foundation for building what I like to think of as a community of practice. A community of practice sort of revolving around these different sort of issues. If you can think of these toolkits as kind of a foundation, and then on the foundation you build a house and invite people to come in and talk about these things and learn about how to use these tools. I think this is what they've created, the Asia Society Policy Institute has created here, is that kind of foundation that would be really important for moving to the next level. In terms of what has been, what we've seen in terms of a response, I think that I like to think of two types of advocacy that are going on here with regard to the Belt and Road. One is this kind of what I call insider advocacy or insider lobbying, where you have groups, NGOs and other types of groups that are going in and working with Chinese directly, sort of behind the scenes on trying to build their capacity. I think the handbook for community engagement that I spoke about last time was one example. And I think, some of the toolkits here are meant for Chinese stakeholders to help build their capacity. And that is another example of that kind of insider advocacy or insider lobbying that I'm referring to. And I said before that I think that kind of lobbying, the results of that lobbying, I think, are still waiting to be seen. I think it's still kind of slow and incremental from the Chinese side, but I'd like to think that there's also this outsider advocacy or outsider lobbying that is really important as well, and that is sort of outside the sort of civil society community organizations or communities that are engaged in media campaigns. They're not really directly communicating with Chinese stakeholders, but they're pushing back in their own way. They're maybe protesting and so forth. And we have seen results from that. I think in the early 2010s in Myanmar, there's a big copper mine that was invested in by a large Chinese state-owned company. And what happened was that the political environment changed in Myanmar. The military regime they ceded power to a civilian government. And that really emboldened villagers in that community to kind of protest. And that resulted in the Chinese company sort of, kind of stepping back and saying, okay, well, we'll do a new ESIA, we will do CSR projects in the community, we will find employment opportunities for villagers. So, that was a real, I think that you could see a response. And that was early on. That was even before the BRI was coined. But then more recently, I think you've seen also in places like Kenya, in the Lamu coal power plant, you have seen that shut down because of civil society organizing around that particular power plant. And that was actually and I think the ICBC, the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, also pulled out in terms of their financing in that particular power plant. And the Chinese embassy, the Chinese ambassador in Kenya, actually came out with a statement that supported this. It said, that China, that we shouldn't be building these kind of coal-fired power plants in places where the communities are opposing that. So I mean, just a few examples of what we've seen in the developing world. And in terms of also just one other example, in terms of labor, what I saw in Zambia with in the copper mines, to see that the mine worker unions were able to get Chinese state-owned companies, large state-owned companies, to come to the table to engage in collective bargaining to improve working conditions and wages in those mines. I mean, that was really an eye-opener for me, because collective bargaining is not really something that is done in China, and yet the Chinese companies had to learn how to abide by Zambian laws and engage in, recognize the union and engage in collective bargaining. So, you see these kind of good examples, these good cases that are still obviously sporadic, but hopefully toolkits like these will help to sort of build a more sustainable foundation for the continued development of this kind of advocacy, and hopefully advocacy that leads also to some kind of engagement between communities and civil society in the host countries and Chinese stakeholders. I think that would be really an ideal situation if the two sides could somehow come together to discuss these kinds of issues. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to turn to Jessica now to jump in on this question.
Thanks. I just wanted to provide a quick resource. It's called the People's Map of Global China, and it's a project that's been going on for, I think, about over a year at this point, and it's a map and it geolocates projects, and one of the main goals of it is to really get a bottom-up collaborative view on these projects. So it's trying to kind of showcase local voices that are often marginalized in kind of the project landscape by either business or political elites. So it's a great resource. It's the People's Map of Global China.
Thanks for that, Jessica. Really appreciate additional resources. And actually, I want to talk about exactly this idea of people who have been marginalized by the discussion on these projects. So I'd love to turn to Jacinta. Jacinta, could you tell us a little bit about how this toolkit addresses the social side of BRI projects, things like gender, minorities, other social aspects of these projects?
Thank you, Rory, for that great question. And so we really prioritize in creating this toolkit, thinking about what inclusivity looks like and how we can ensure that BRI projects can be more inclusive and sustainable in their outcomes. And so in terms of the guidance that we provided, we discussed the use of local languages and dialects in communication between the Chinese and the local communities. And we talked about ways in which land rights and rights to property can be recognized for Indigenous peoples and women and ethnic and religious minorities. And so we placed a big emphasis on how we can support these more disadvantaged and vulnerable populations and the specific steps that could be taken to ensure that they're included and consulted in ways that they're comfortable with and that their rights are recognized.
Thanks for that. I think this is another important aspect that the international community should spend a little time and attention on, so that we're not just, promoting development, that we're promoting sustainable development and inclusive development. I'd like to turn to all of the panelists for last words. And the question I will start you off with, but please feel free to comment on any aspect of this discussion, is where do you think the BRI is going in the next couple of years? We're obviously still living in pandemic times. Travel has been curtailed. I imagine a lot of the development on these projects has been slowed. As Danny referenced earlier, the global economy is slowing. So, BRI came onto the scene very flashy and heavy. Are we going to see it start to calm down, to start to wane on its pace in the coming years. Let me start with Blake.
Thanks, Rory. My views on the Belt and Road trajectory. Well, I mean, certainly when the BRI was launched in 2013 and versus now, China's growth isn't the same. So obviously the capacity for, China Development Bank or China Export-Import Bank, to provide funding to these projects are not as wide as they used to be. I mean, went from 75 billion in 2016 between those two banks to virtually a standstill in 2021. So there is a slowdown, but I would say that you should not mistake a slowdown for the end of the Belt and Road. I think what we're truly beginning to see is somewhat of a transition away from these kind of big ticket, labor-intensive, capital-intensive projects to more nimbler projects, to smarter projects, right? I mean, we've seen now the Digital Silk Road be elevated within the BRI, under the BRI umbrella. So I expect, not as many high-speed railways, but more Huawei, ZTE-like projects, smart cities, smart ports, that still pack the same kind of influence or punch, but don't cost as much, don't involve Chinese laborers going over. So I think that, from my perspective, that's the way that the Belt and Road is going to go.
Thanks for that. And there's a lot we could discuss in there, especially in terms of how the U.S. and the West are seeing those types of developments, particularly the technological side of the smart infrastructure projects. But for another time, Shawn, I'd like to turn to you. Any parting thoughts or thoughts on where BRI is headed?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think that, I would agree with Blake that the Belt and Road will continue. But I think the form will change, right? I mean, I think it will move away from, again, emphasizing those big ticket infrastructure projects. So I think we'll see more diversification, moving to sort of looking at some of the other goals of the Belt and Road, for example, financial integration, people-to-people ties. I mean, that's another important part of the Belt and Road, and something that I think needs to be, that kind of got a late start, but I think we're seeing more emphasis on that with the vaccine and mass distribution to developing countries. Healthcare, I think China feels like they have a healthcare system, a model that they can export lessons to the developing countries. And I think more engagement between people through maybe educational exchanges, trainings. I think some people talked about upskilling of workers, and so I think more need for that. So I think we'll see more along those lines. But I think what we're seeing is that the Belt and Road is also, I mean, it's taking place at a time where I think we have a movement towards higher standards globally. I mean, not just, you have the SDGs, but you also have more business and human rights due diligence standards, labor standards. I mean, this is the Belt and China has a long relationship with developing countries. I mean, going back to the 50s and 60s. But the 50s and 60s were a very different time than now. And I think China is now beginning to realize that they're working and they're doing this in a very different era. So I hope that they'll adapt to that. I mean, I hope the Belt and Road will adapt in ways that will recognize those higher standards. Thanks.
Thanks, Shawn. Jessica, parting words?
Sure. Thanks for that, Shawn. I think I was on a similar line of thought. I guess a question is really, what is the measurement of the Belt and Road Initiative? I think so often we're talking about big infrastructure projects, and as data came out pointing to slowdowns there, that would be one thing during the bid. But, there's, I believe, a few different ways to think about this. One is kind of high-level diplomatic engagements, measuring trade, investment, standards harmonization as part of the Belt and Road, kind of the subnational engagement where provincial and municipal governments are engaging on their own terms. So I think as the BRI evolves, we're going to be studying these things more deeply, and we can't just measure if infrastructure finance has dropped, but look at perhaps if, what the trade and investment flows are, how subnational actors are engaging. So I think being kind of fine-tuned in how we define the Belt and Road. And then I've been doing a lot of thinking about the US and China and the now named Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And I think having that framed as a rival or a alternative to the BRI is not necessarily helpful. If we really want to elevate standards and practices, and I'd argue that any Western or US-led effort should not be framed as competing or countering, but really the point would be to ensure positive social and environmental outcomes if it's about infrastructure, delivering infrastructure around the world. So I guess I will I'll end with that, not framing it as competition. On to the next.
Thank you. Danny, you get the final word.
Thanks. Well, my fellow panelists have made some great points. What I'd say is that, in essence, the Belt and Road is not going away. It's not going away, but it is definitely changing in its character. I find the Chinese to be very innovative, creative, opportunistic, and certainly they're moving in directions Shawn mentioned, into the digital Silk Road, into the space and information corridor, the health Silk Road, those sorts of areas. But they are making the Belt and Road more cost effective. They have to be more cost conscious because there is no longer simply the inexhaustible artesian well of money from the Chinese treasury to cover anything that had a BRI label slapped on it. The conundrum they face is that what really has to happen for the future of Belt and Road projects is for the Chinese to be able to harness foreign capital, commercial capital, international capital. But the prerequisite for getting private capital into these projects, and right now there's virtually none of it, is that the projects have to be de-risked. So to Jessica's point, I think on the one hand, we have this initiative, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure, that's all about mobilizing and leveraging private capital, but doesn't really have much by way of deals, let alone pure developing world construction capability. And with BRI, you've got just the opposite. So through our toolkit, through other measures, as BRI projects can become better designed and therefore lower risk, I think the door opens to opportunities for private capital. And I never thought I would utter these words, but it does meet the definition of a win-win outcome.
Well, I have to close on that comment. With that, thank you so much to Jessica, Shawn, Blake, Jacinta, Danny, for taking the time today to not only walk us through this amazing new digital toolkit that's been developed, but also to talk about some of these larger issues, the motivation for putting this information in a centralized place. And clearly there's more to discuss. So I hope we'll have an opportunity to come back in later dates with more work from the Asia Society Policy Institute and to continue this conversation. But with that, I'd like to say good night or good morning to you wherever you are. And thank you so much for joining us.